Well, folks, welcome to part three of our notes on cell organelles and the cell. Today, we're going to talk about the cytoskeleton and the nucleus to finish up our discussion of these organelles and the cells. So, we'll start off with the cytoskeleton. As the name implies, it's the skeleton for the cell, cyto. The skeleton of the cell. So it's dynamic, meaning it's not just a static, cage or cell wall kind of thing like with a plant. Um, it's a lot of it can move actually. It's a elaborate series of rods running all the way through the cytosol on the underside of the cell membrane, doing its thing. It consists mainly of microtubules, microfilaments, and intermediate filaments. And here we can see those a little bit closer up. We've got a nice false color image here of some microfilaments, which are made up of actin, which is one of the main proteins that we find in muscles that can move. So that gives you a clue that this one's about doing some movement stuff. Here we've got intermediate filaments. Kind of looks like wire cable, right? Like steel cabling. So it is pretty strong, just like it looks. And then on the bottom, if I stop moving around, that thing will go away. We've got the microtubules, much bigger in there as well, little stiffer, just like tubular steel would be stiffer than the same volume of steel in a solid bar. And the other thing I like to point out is filament, to me, sounds smaller than tubule down here. So the filaments are both smaller than the tubule. And then between the two filaments, we have micro, small, and intermediate, medium. So we got small, medium, and large, basically. So microtubules, we'll start with those. They're hollow tubes, and they determine the overall shape of the cell and kind of distribution of the organelles. So it gives the organelles something to kind of hang on to so they stay roughly in place. They're not just floating around willy-nilly and drifting all the time. They can move along it up to a certain extent, but it keeps them relatively in place. So this is the one that's most like a static skeleton of any of them. Microfilaments, the one made with actin, which is part of the muscles, remember actin is. These are attached to the cytoplasmic side of the plasma membrane, meaning the inside of the plasma membrane. So they brace and strengthen the cell surface because they're there, make it a little tougher and not too squishy. Okay, so it's a little bit stiffer, more like a weak plastic than, say, a wet tissue or something. And they function in both endo and exocytosis, which we'll learn in the next section of this unit are types of active transport. Their job is to basically open up the cell membrane to let things in to the cell, big things into the cell, endocytosis, or open up the cell membrane to let big things out of the cell, exocytosis. So this is where the movement part comes in. And if you're talking about things like amoeba, these are the things that are actually making the amoebas move. But we're focusing on humans here. And the last type we have to talk about is intermediate filaments. Okay. And like I said before, they look like steel cables and they have high tensile strength like steel cables. They're really good at resisting pulling forces, just like those cables are. So they resist pulling forces and help to form desmosomes. If you remember from the first part of these notes, desmosomes were the cell connections that help keep the cells from ripping apart. So you got a lot of them, things like your skin or your muscles, where they have to resist pulling forces so the tissue doesn't rip apart. You've got desmosomes holding those cells together. Those desmosomes are made up of intermediate filaments, and those intermediate filaments run throughout the cell so the cell doesn't get pulled apart itself. Cilia, not a silly topic. It's a terrible joke. I shouldn't have said it. Anyway, these are whip-like. They kind of move like this. Motile, meaning movable. Cellular extensions on the exposed surfaces of certain cells. What that means is you got these little whip-like things on the surface of some cells. Okay, and their job is to move substances in one direction across a cell membrane. So I liken this, if you've ever been to like a concert or a sporting event at a big arena and somebody lets loose, beach balls or whatever, and everybody's stuck in the stands and they're moving the beach ball around trying to get to go back up the stands and over. Their arms are like the cilia on the surface, and they're moving the beach ball along. So here's a little GIF of that just to give you a little visual. You got all those people there, and they're all holding pretty steady and still. They can't move around. That's like the cell's surface. And then these balls would be like, say, mucus in your throat. And these cilia are there to move that mucus up and out of your throat so it doesn't get down into your lungs. So that's kind of what that looks like. Here's a short video of cilia in action, just to get a view of them.
The hollow passages that go from our nose to our lungs are lined with cells like this that are covered with tiny hairs which sway backward and forward in a layer of mucus. They are the cilia. They sweep out any harmful particles and microorganisms that enter the trachea from the outside.
They are made up of the same thing as centrioles, which we might talk about a little bit more later. Here we can see a little bit more. I'm going to reduce my picture size. Here we can see their motion. They stand up like this, and then they push things that way, and then they come back, they come like this. And anybody who's a swimmer probably recognizes that motion. That's the same thing you do to when you're swimming, like underwater. Push, and then bring it back so you don't push things the other direction. And it's ready to move it along. Okay, so you could get something like this going where here's the cells, here's the cilia, and they're moving this layer of mucus along if it's in the respiratory tract. In fact, you swallow so you're always producing mucus up in your nose and your sinuses, right? And that mucus is constantly draining down the back of your throat. It catches all those bacteria and dust particles and things like that, so that's not suspended in the air that's getting into your lungs and clogging them up. So you got to clean out that dirty mucus, though. So that mucus is constantly draining out the back of your sinuses, down your throat. And when it gets down in here, you don't want it going down into your trachea and then into your lungs, right? You don't want pneumonia. You don't want to get that junk in there. So you've got a whole bunch of these cilia pushing that mucus back up and dumping it into your esophagus, okay, where the esophagus and trachea run right next to each other. So you push it up the trachea and then dump it down into the esophagus. So you swallow it and you basically digest it, which kills the stuff and gets rid of it. And most of us, even when we're not sick, are swallowing close to a cup of mucus every day. Part of your diet, I guess. When you're sick, it's even more. It could be a couple of cups, 3 cups. Maybe that's why people are sometimes not that hungry when they get sick. Don't know. All right. Moving on to the nucleus. Pretty straightforward. Not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's got the nuclear envelope around the outside, nucleoli, little dark spots inside, and chromatin, which is just the uncoiled DNA. It is the gene-containing control center of the cell. It's the manager of the cell. It determines what happens. It does that because it holds the DNA and protects it. And that's where DNA gets copied into mRNA to take the message out to the ribosomes so they make the proteins, and the proteins control everything else. So that's how the nucleus controls things. It protects and houses the DNA and makes the mRNA in there to get sent out so you can make proteins out with the ribosomes. So it's dictating what proteins are going to be synthesized, when they're synthesized, and how many of them are synthesized. And that's what controls you. Here we can see one. We got the membrane envelope here. We've got these pores, these big things. That's where the mRNA can come out to get to all these ribosomes so you can make the proteins. We have the nucleolus in there, which helps to make some of the ribosomal subunits. And then all this other stuff is chromatin, all the DNA when it's in the unwound state. Like I said, the nucleoli, dark staining little spherical bodies, and that's where you make ribosomes and the ribosome parts. And that is it for our notes on cell organelles and cell function at this point in time. We'll move on to cell transport, how we move things in and out of cells and around within cells next. And then we'll get even deeper into cell functions when we start looking at specialized cell functions and tissue types in our histology unit, which will be our next unit. So that is it for now, folks, and I will see you soon.